Welcome back to the Play by Play Podcast YouTube channel. And finally, it is the return of NBA basketball content on this channel. It feels like it's been a while since we've talked about the NBA. Of course, we've had a couple of mock draft videos here and there to take a look at the upcoming NBA draft. But overall, just looking at the league overall and what has been going on and breaking news within the NBA, it feels like it has been a while since we've covered it because, of course, there is a lot going on in basketball. Just been a little bit distracted of what all has been going on within the NFL and, of course, to the new start of the year with boxing and whatnot. But today we're going to be discussing what I believe to be two pretty important topics. The first one's going to be really quick. We're going to be talking about Chris Paul, his retirement, and what he brought to the NBA and the legacy that he's leaving behind. But the second thing to me is even more important with the NBA now getting into more serious talks of a possible NBA expansion, with all of this talk now about people disliking this idea of tanking and wanting to fix it, and how, this expansion draft might actually help that, and maybe some other, solutions to the tanking issue that the NBA could add into this as a whole. But before we get all into that, I'm going to extend this intro even longer because I want to encourage you guys to go down below, subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave a like on this video, as well as comment on it and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, go ahead and follow us on all social medias, that being TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. All of those ads are going to be down below. We're on all of those social medias. You will get to see my latest reactions to breaking news within the NBA, the NFL, and combat sports. And you will never miss for whenever the podcast decides to upload an episode. And without further ado, let's not waste any more of your time. Let's get into it. So let's start this off with the quicker topic of the day. And this is something that I wanted to cover because I do feel like it is important and is a little bit of a topic of discussion, as at 40 years old, after what was it, a 21-year career, I believe, Chris Paul has finally decided to announce his retirement from the NBA. And this is a massive, massive loss, especially, and I talked about this on my TikTok, for those of us like me who started watching basketball within the late 2000s and throughout the 2010s. Chris Paul he's there with so many of the other retirees that we're going to see coming through within the next couple of years. Guys like James Harden and Russell Westbrook and Curry and Kevin Durant. And of course, the big one being LeBron James. Chris Paul is with that type of generation of players. And he was a part of what, in my opinion, was one of the most underrated, iconic teams of all time, that being the Lob City LA Clippers. But he also delivered on a lot of really, really great teams as well that had, potential to go out and win NBA titles. That 2021 Phoenix Suns teams, of course, the 3 years that he was in Houston with James Harden, all of the moments that they had to beat the Golden State Warriors with Kevin Durant. Chris Paul has contributed plenty of amazing moments to this league. He has had so many different career highlights. He has a extensive resume, 12-time NBA All-Star, 4-time All-NBA first team, was Rookie of the Year, I believe, all the way back in 2006, 6-time steals leader with the NBA, adding in also 5-time NBA assist leader in this league. One of them, which came in 2022 when he was, 37, 36 years old. And he did it all. He was one of the best perimeter guard defenders in the league for a very long time. And he did all of this being listed at only 6'1", 6 feet inches tall, really, when you're looking at Chris Paul. He was somebody, and I talked about this as well, that I think revived a little bit of the mid-range game when it came to the guard position. I remember he had this capability of always being able to get to those elbows on the free throw line and just hit that mid-range jumper whenever he wanted to. He was a master of the pick and roll. I could go on and on and on. The point being is that Chris Paul is an absolute legend. He is 100% a future Hall of Famer, and he is one of the greatest point guards of all time. But that being said, the question that I want to prompt to you guys, the question that I want to be asked, and that we will talk about a little bit here today, is what is the legacy that Chris Paul leaves behind? Where does he exactly rank amongst the greatest point guards of all time? Because yes, we just named off a bunch of amazing accomplishments, but we can't forget that never had an NBA title, only sniffed the finals once with that 2021-2022 Phoenix Sun team. Had an opportunity, and some would say choked it away. Now, yes, of course, there are players that you're never going to put Chris Paul in front of. Guys like Magic Johnson and Stephen Curry and Isaiah Thomas, who had 2 NBA titles. Oscar Robertson, who was named Mr. Triple-Double and whatnot. Those type of guys, to me, are almost fully enveloped in that top 5 of all-time point guards. Maybe not Robertson. Maybe that's a little bit more arguable. But putting Chris Paul next to the others, guys like John Stockton, who we just talked about, Chris Paul leading the league in assists and steals. Stockton leads it all time in both. You have somebody like Steve Nash, who was a 2-time MVP. Chris Paul never won an MVP and was one of the most efficient shooters of all time. Jason Kidd, one of the most unique type of point guards because of his ability to use his height and his body to rebound the basketball and get it out in space, was a 1-time champion, even though it was a little bit later in his career, and was still a starter. And even a guy like Russell Westbrook, who has an MVP, who, yes, does not have an NBA championship to his name, but averaged a triple-double, for one entire season. That is the stuff that Chris Paul is realistically going against. And so the question is, how does he stack up, and where does he really rank amongst those guys? And there's a couple of others that I didn't name that could or could not be in the conversation, guys like Jerry West and whatnot, but those are normally the main guys that you can work into. And the thing about Chris Paul, when you really look at his career as a whole and his statistics, is you're going to find it is efficiency over volume. He's not going to have like the most blown away scoring numbers that you've seen out of a player. In fact, only averaged over 20 points per game twice in his career, and that was early on in his 3rd and 4th year in New Orleans. After that, averaged under 20 points per game, but did have double-double type numbers multiple times within the NBA, 21.1 points per game, 11.6 assists back in 2007, 2008. You move to 2013, averaged 10 assists per game, averaged 19 points per game. You move all the way down to Phoenix back in 2021, 2022 when they made that finals run, averaged 14.7 points per game and 11 assists. You take a look at the field goal numbers, almost all of them are nearly at 50% off of a career, averaged 47% from the field, which is fantastic, especially for a man of his caliber that's able to pass the ball. You look at the playoffs, while he may not have the most blown-away scoring numbers in the regular season, has some great scoring numbers within the playoffs, 25 points per game with the Clippers all the way back in 2017. 24 points per game in his first playoff run with the New Orleans Hornets all the way back in 2008. Like, he was a great player. Higher shooting percentage in the playoffs at 48%. That being said, when I'm looking at Chris Paul, I would take Stockton over Chris Paul. I think I would take Jason Kidd, not just on a statistical basis, but on what Kidd offered me within the rebounding game. Still a tremendous passer. As efficient as Chris Paul was, I think that I would take somebody like a Steve Nash over Chris Paul, potentially. Yes, was a more system-type point guard, you could say, and thrived in a certain system, but still was able to put up unbelievable numbers and had all-time level efficiency, especially from the three-point line and the free throw line, respectively. Heck, I would take Chris Paul over Russell Westbrook, in my opinion, but I think Westbrook has a case as well, especially with his ability to attack the basket. Yes, CP3 is a more complete player. I would personally take CP3 over Westbrook, especially for the elite shooting efficiency that comes with Chris Paul that you don't get from Westbrook, especially in that three-point game. But to me, I think that there's real argument that Chris Paul lands outside of the top 5 point guards of all time. I mentioned Curry. I mentioned Magic. This is in no particular order, by the way. Isaiah Thomas. Sure, let's go ahead and throw Oscar Robertson in there. That's 4. Then I just said Stockton. I just said Kidd. There's a potential for Nash. So potentially for Chris Paul here, we're looking at a guy that's between the 6th and 8th best point guards of all time. Tremendous. Being top 10 in anything, especially in the NBA, is incredible. Next to nothing. But you have to wonder how much was left on the table for Chris Paul. How much would he have been pushed forward had he won that title in 2022? How much would he have been pushed forward had he not had early playoff exits with the Clippers, especially back in games like 2013 and 2016? How much more would he have been pushed forward if he was not outplayed by other guards like named Steph Curry in those playoffs and regular season games within the mid 2010s? Chris Paul is an amazing point guard. I have no doubt about that. But you also have to consider how much better his career could have been. Just like you have to consider how much better Steve Nash's career would have been had he won an NBA championship in Phoenix. How much better John Stockton would have been as on the point guard list had he not had to face Jordan twice in the NBA Finals. Those are questions that we just have to think about. And Chris Paul is a phenomenal point guard. Like I said, one of the greatest of all time, probably within that 5 to 8, 6 to 8 range. But to me, if Chris Paul wins a title, I think that there is genuine conversation and he is almost a shoo-in to be a top 5 point guard of all time. But let me know what y'all think about that. Now, transitioning from the past to the present and even now into the future, that's where we get into our next topic of this video. That being the NBA seriously considering expanding the league, potentially within the next couple of years or seasons, potentially confirming this within the next year or year and a half, with obviously the potential cities being Las Vegas and Seattle. Seattle obviously had an NBA team prior to that. He's one that a lot of NBA fans for years and years and years, since the Sonics have had to move to OKC, have been wanting back. It would definitely be an interesting storyline, especially with OKC still being in the league. And then, of course, Las Vegas, one of the biggest cities in America, Sin City, would be a massive, massive money booster for the NBA. To have a Las Vegas team would be a gold mine market for the NBA to go ahead and market in for their league. Those are the two cities that are being talked about right now to be expanded to. And this is really important because not only are you talking about the state of the league changing in terms of the number of teams and 2 whole new teams in general coming into it, but the NBA to me right now has quickly had a rising identity crisis in my eyes, or at least has had a loss to its entertainment value. And there's been a lot brought up by fans and analysts about a lot of frustration, especially looking at the bottom of the league. I mean, you try not to make these comparisons because obviously they're different leagues in different sports. They have different rules and there's different ways that different leagues go about things. But I was thinking about this the other day. When you take a look at the NFL, for example, let's compare the NBA to the NFL. When you compare the NFL from 2015 to now, to this year, to this season that just happened, you will see relatively the same teams towards the top, right? You had Denver, who won the Super Bowl back in 2015, was the number 1 seed this year. New England, right up there, number 2, both in 2015 and 2026. You had the Ravens were in the mix, a team like the Indianapolis Colts were in the mix back in the early to mid 2010s to now in 2026. You look at the NFC, you had the Seattle Seahawks, a team like that, the Green Bay Packers and whatnot. Similar teams were at the top of the league when you compare it from 2015 to 2026. The differences between the NBA and the NFL is when you look at the era between 2015 and 2026, between 2016 and 2025, there were several different teams that arose for the NFL during that period. The Denver Broncos were horrid from 2016 to about 2024. The Kansas City Chiefs owned the AFC West. I didn't even bring up the Chargers. The Chargers were great in both 2015 and now in 2026, but let's return. You had teams in the AFC South like the Jacksonville Jaguars and some years the Houston Texans and the Tennessee Titans, who made a lot of deep playoff runs and whatnot. Those teams, the Jacksonville Jaguars, every AFC South team outside of the Indianapolis Colts. You had the Miami Dolphins in the mix for a couple of years atop the AFC East. The Buffalo Bills came into prominence within that time period and still are now, obviously. You look in the NFC, you had teams like, you still had similar teams like maybe like the Niners back in 2015. But between 2015 and 2026, the Niners went through a little bit of a rough patch for about 2 or 3 years. The Rams were a little bit in there. Point being is, when you look at the scope of the NBA now, there's not a ton difference between 2015, 2026, and especially the time between it. Like teams like the Cavs and the Raptors and the Sixers and even the Celtics at certain points within that time frame, the Miami Heat, those have all been teams that have been in the top 8 mix in the Eastern Conference. Meanwhile, teams like the Chicago Bulls, the Charlotte Hornets, the Washington Wizards at certain points later within the 2010s and early 2020s, the Brooklyn Nets, of course, those have been teams that have always been at the bottom of the East. You take a look at the West. Sure, there's a couple of new players. The Los Angeles Lakers were horrid throughout the mid-2010s until LeBron was able to finally get there and really begin their rebuild. But the Thunder are back. The Thunder were there in 2015. The Thunder weren't really bad until 2021, 2020 range, maybe 2021, 2022. The Spurs are still atop of this. Sure, they went through some rough spots too, but more or less were able to stay afloat. The Rockets, same thing. The Warriors were able to come back and win a title in 2022, even at a time where a lot of people felt that their dynasty was long gone. And you see teams like the Utah Jazz, Sacramento Kings, even now because there's been a little bit more of a flip once again, the Memphis Grizzlies. You've seen similar teams near the bottom of the standings. Now, what does that come down to? There's plenty of measures that you could add it up to, right? Sometimes it is on the management of the roster, their ability to draft. Like, for example, I don't think the Chicago Bulls have drafted very well. I don't think that the Brooklyn Nets have drafted very well. It could come down to the staff that you pick and their inability to develop talent, which has been a huge problem with a lot of these teams. It could be the market size. Obviously, even though the Lakers and the Celtics went through some rough patches throughout the mid-2010s, they were eventually able to rebound because of their massive market and their major history. My point being is that the NBA needs to switch things up. These teams, majority of these teams, have been near the top of the sport for the last 8 to 10 years. And yes, there have been some surprises, like the Detroit Pistons being number 1 in the Eastern Conference right now. But there's also a major gap between the top half of the league and the bottom half. And that, to me, is the biggest problem in this all. Because, again, comparing it to the NFL, in my opinion, it takes about 5 to 6 weeks to really begin to separate who's the championship contenders to the people that are not. And even then, sometimes you still can't do that because by week 5, week 6, you have teams that are 2-3 and 3-3 and maybe have faced some tough opponents or have gone through a rough patch and are able to rebound within the second half of the season. Like, we don't have the truest playoff picture probably till about week 10, week 11-ish. Meanwhile, in the NBA, in my opinion, it takes about maybe a week of the season, 2 weeks of the season for us to already see who's going to be at the bottom and who's going to be at the top. And again, there are outliers like the Chicago Bulls who started off 7-0, 8-0, 9-0 to start the year off and who were the number 1 seed for a second. Eventually were able to fall down. But generally, the playoff picture already becomes into the mix within about 2 weeks of the NBA starting. Within us being, about maybe 8 to 15 games in, which is a massive, massive issue, especially once you get into the bulk of the middle of the season where viewer fatigue finally begins to set in. Now, going back to the expansion and why this is so important, First of all, this is really important because both of these teams are in the Western Conference, which the West, to me, even though there have been some Eastern Conference highlights, Celtics winning the championship, Bucks winning the championship, it's been almost back and forth. The Western Conference still has much more deeper talent to their name than the East. So adding these two expansion teams in, you're obviously going to have some movements of conferences right now. Right now, and what was discussed over the past year or so with this becoming more of a possibility of expansion is that the Memphis Grizzlies and the Minnesota Timberwolves would move over to the East. They are the closest geographically to the Eastern Conference, which for the East would be a massive, massive bring to them, especially the Timberwolves, who have a superstar in Anthony Edwards and who have been in good competition within the playoffs for the last couple of seasons. The Minnesota Timberwolves could be a real player within the Eastern Conference. Now, the Grizzlies, they just flipped their squad. They're going through a little bit of a rough patch and a rebuild, but they do have certain pieces that they could build around, especially Cedric Howard. You could see them, if they do this thing right, if they do build this thing right, could be back up into the middle of the standings, within the next 2 to 3 years. And especially in a weak Eastern Conference, that'll make that easier for them. And then obviously adding in these two Western Conference teams who, in my opinion, won't have a difficult time building their teams, especially Vegas, where it's going to be a wanted market. That is going to up the level in both conferences tremendously. Sure, the West might be the better conference to some certain extent, especially if a team like Vegas gets hot immediately. But the East will have added talent to it, so on and so forth. Again, though, the problem is working in talent, improving these rosters. Which in the NBA expansion draft, I want to mention this real quick because I just skipped over it and I shouldn't have. To start an NBA expansion team, it is very, very difficult to get your feet off of the floor. Charlotte Bobcats are a prime example. I mean, that was a poverty franchise for very, very long time. Then ended up turning into the Charlotte Hornets, who are still a poverty franchise at this moment. The reason this is the case is because when an expansion happens, if you don't know the ruling of the expansion draft, current NBA teams are allowed to protect 8 players from the expansion draft. And then the remainder pool of players obviously get put into a pool for the expansion teams to go ahead and draft off of. And then I think, looking at the history of expansion teams and the NBA draft, I believe that they give them like the 2 top 5 picks. So like if Vegas and Seattle came into this, Vegas would get the number 4 overall pick in this year's draft. Let's just say they came in this year, and then Seattle would get the number 5 overall, which would be very valuable overall picks right now. But teams get to protect 8 total players for their roster. A lot of the pool is going to be full of very, very expensive veteran type guys, because a lot of these teams are going to either look to protect their youngest rookies that they have the most futuristic value in, or their top stars that they have currently right now. And this is interesting, especially with a team like the Oklahoma City Thunder, who are dominating the league right now. Go ahead and take a look at this OKC roster and start to really pin down who could be protected and not protected, for example. And this is just one team example of how this could go. You take a look at this. I mean, let's count this out. I mean, Jalen Williams is probably 1,000% a keep for them. Cason Wallace is probably 1,000% a keep, especially at 22 years old. Nikola Topic is probably, without a doubt, a big-time keep for them because he was a rookie that they drafted and is slowly starting to get more playing time as he comes back from his cancer diagnosis. Jared McCain, who they just trade for, is probably a guaranteed keep for OKC. Obviously, you have SGA, you have Chet down there, so that's 6 players. And then from there, they're going to have to pick through certain rotational players. So probably maybe somebody like an AJ Mitchell because he's very young. And let's just go ahead and throw in, who else? Other Jalen Williams. Let's say that they bring back Jalen Williams too, because they just did sign him to an extension. That is 8 players right there, which means that just off of OKC alone, you would have a pool of Isaiah Hartenstein, Thomas Schwarber, who was a really, really great center at Georgetown and has gotten very, very minimal playing time on OKC. But Isaiah Hartenstein, Alex Caruso, Lou Dort, Isaiah Joe potentially, Aaron Wiggins, Kenrich Williams, who, yes, is older, but is still a really, really good player. That is 6 guys right there that you could potentially pick out of from OKC. Let's move to the Denver Nuggets. That's a team that maybe could potentially have some youthful depth because they've drafted so well. If you look at Denver, obviously Jokic is probably going to be a keep. I would guess that Cam Johnson would be a keep because they traded away MPJ. Jamal would be a big-time keep for them. Then after that, you'd have to start looking at a lot of their young guys. So guys like Jalen Pickett, Spencer Jones, Christian Brown will 100% be a keep. Peyton Watson would potentially be a keep. And then they're going on and they're picking from guys like, Julian Strawther, Deron Holmes, or Aaron Gordon and whatnot, who I didn't mention. So from there, let's just say that they do end up keeping Aaron Gordon because that is a big-time part of their team. You would then have an added player pool of Julian Strawther, Deron Holmes II, Jonas Valanciunas potentially, Bruce Brown would be in there, Zeke Naji, who has had some really, really solid development. My point being is that there is a lot of, I forgot that go there. Let me go back here. There is a lot of big-time talent that is not getting enough opportunity in the NBA right now. So it would be possible, it would be good right now for the NBA to end up expanding the league because there is enough talent that could go out to the expansion teams. Those 2 areas would be big enough markets for free agents and other rookies to want to go to for them to be able to build their roster. And it would especially thin the roster of a lot of other teams, especially these top-heavy teams like Denver, like OKC, like potentially even like the Detroit Pistons who just started building up their roster. Let's go ahead and look at Detroit potentially and what they could do. Obviously, you're going to keep Cade Cunningham. You're going to keep Jalen Duren. You're probably going to keep Ron Holland. They just traded for Kevin Huerter. That's going to be a big part potentially there. After that, maybe somebody like a Bobby Clinton maybe, or like a Wendell Moore Jr., Isaiah Stewart probably in there, Asar. But outside of that, guys like Marcus Sasser, potentially a good three-point shooter with Duncan Robinson. Chaz Lanier, who was solid all the way back in Tennessee a year ago, who they drafted. Tobias Harris is a good veteran. There is going to be talent to be able to add onto these rosters right away. It's not going to be a Charlotte Bobcats situation where you get such low-level talent in a market that nobody wants to go into that is going to be difficult to really develop those rosters. But coming back to my point in the NBA and especially the want to change how tanking works in the league right now, because there's been a lot of gripe about teams sitting players who maybe have mild injuries and they end up bringing them out for the season or adjusting certain minutes and making the games less entertaining, especially midway to late through the season. And half the league really being out of it by like 2 to 3 weeks in, like we were talking about. What is the best way that you realistically fix that? And in my opinion, you have to find a way to get the best young talent onto your worst teams. And because of that, my thinking behind this, and this is not a 100% foolproof fix that this is going to fix tanking. There is potential that it could make tanking even worse, in my opinion, because of what I'm about to discuss. That is abolishing the draft lottery. Yes, it is a big time show and piece of entertainment for the NBA to use. It is a huge way for them to be able to promote the incoming rookies into this year's draft and being able to market them to the certain franchises to get top picks. I understand that. But in my opinion, there should not be a world where a team is winning, 15 to 25 to even 30 of 82 games and getting screwed out of their top 3 pick. That to me is something that shouldn't be possible in the NBA. And that to me is one of the reasons why we see so many of these rosters struggle to build themselves up. 2019, I think, is the perfect example of this because you had rosters that desperately needed help at this time. Let's go ahead. I'm going to bring up the NBA standings for that 2019-2020 season. I think that this was the one. No, it was 2018-2019. Excuse me for just a second. You had teams like the Phoenix Suns, who won 19 total games back in 2018-2019. You had a team like the Chicago Bulls, who won 22 games and lost 60 in 2018 and 2019. You had a team like the Cleveland Cavaliers who won 19 games and lost 63 back in 2018, 2019. And what ended up happening? The top 3 picks ended up going to the New Orleans Pelicans, who won 33 total games and were only near the bottom of the Western Conference standings because the Western Conference was so stacked. The Memphis Grizzlies, who also won 33 games. The Los Angeles Lakers got a top 4 pick, winning nearly 40 games, and were in discussion for a play-in spot. If the play-in was a thing that year, would have been a play-in team. Those were 3 of the top 4 picks in that draft. And teams like the Cavs and the Bulls and the Suns, they got the 5th pick, the 6th pick, the 7th pick, and gone from getting top heavy level talent like Ja Morant and RJ Barrett, and potentially even in the Zion stakes for that year. I'm not talking about what those players are right now. I'm talking about what they were back in 2018, 2019 in college. You had that level of talent, and yet you had these 20-win game teams getting Darius Garland and Kobe White and players like that. No disrespect to any of those guys. Both of those guys that I just mentioned are still in the league and are still rotational level guards. And in the case of Darius Garland, is an all-star level type guard. But to me, how is that possible? How can that happen? How does that make your league better if the worst teams are not getting the best talent? One of the reasons why the NFL is continuously changing, is continuously flipping when it comes to the top and lower level teams, is because if you are the worst team in the league, you are going to have a chance to draft the best player in the draft. Now, again, situations don't always work out. Certain teams don't know how to develop certain players. There might be something that happens. Somebody gets traded, yada, yada, yada. Things happen, I understand. And not every number 1 overall pick in NBA or NFL history has completely worked out. But at least teams that have been bad have had an opportunity in the NFL to improve their roster that way. And especially in the NBA, which is not like the NFL. It's not 11 on 11, it's 5 on 5 basketball. Because there are so many fewer spots on an NBA roster, it is so much more detrimental to an NBA team. Because you're talking about 1 player out of 5 versus 1 player out of 11. Sure, if you get the number 1 pick in the NFL, your team might improve a little bit. But if you get a number 1 overall quarterback, you still need to go out and improve your offensive line. You still need to go out and get that guy playmakers. It still takes time. Within the NBA, though, if you don't get that number 1 overall pick, or let's say you do get it and that player doesn't end up working out, that is a huge detriment to your roster, to the starting 5 or the 5 that you end up putting out on the floor, because they have so much more impact than the 11 guys on the NFL field. You could have 10 guys. You could have probably the best roster in the NFL outside of, let's say, the center position. And you could have the worst center in the NFL or a backup center and whatnot. And that team is likely still going to win games. Whereas on an NBA floor, especially if you were just to turn this 5 on 5, remove the benches for a second, if you were to take a team with the 5 best guys in the league and another team with 4 of the 5 best guys in the league and a complete backup or one of the worst players in the league, that would have a much more detrimental effect on the floor. Because it's 1 of 5, it's not 1 of 11. So to me, NBA picks are a lot more valuable. And the fact that we are doing this through a lottery system, which I don't want to go there, but there are still questions about how that is run and how that has gone on in past years. And certain markets have been favored over others potentially and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to get into that today. But with the questions that have been around it, it makes it much more difficult for rosters to be able to develop. Look at the Charlotte Hornets, for for example, as bad as they have been throughout NBA history, how many times have they landed a top 3 pick in the NBA? I'm going to look it up right now. I'm looking up the draft history. They were number 4 overall this year, number 6 overall. They did land number 2 back in 2023, but before that, number 13, number 11, and whatnot. And yes, some of these are based off of, where they were at in the lottery and their limited odds and yada, yada, yada. But the point being is the Hornets have been one of the worst, most irrelevant franchises in the league. And yet, they've had almost little to no talent going through their system, even from the NBA draft. So if the league is looking to expand, that would be great. It would move more talent into the Eastern Conference right away. It would bring in 2 gigantic markets that a lot of players would be attracted to. It would thin the rosters in the NBA, yada, yada, yada. There would be a lot of great things that come from an expansion. But for me, for the NBA, if you want to stop tanking, if you want to increase the entertainment value of your product, outside of obviously the obvious things that need to happen, like shortening the season from 82 games, because that's a given in my eyes, which is never going to happen, by the way. And the draft lottery thing might never ever happen either, but it's just a suggestion. But if you want to make your league more competitive, the best young players coming out of college, coming from overseas, need to go to your worst teams. There's a reason why the Chicago Bulls, the Chicago Bears, the Denver Broncos, the New England Patriots were all in the playoffs this year. Because they all had top picks 2 to 3 years ago, got top-level quarterbacks, top-level talent, and were able to obviously go out and get head coaches and get other talent that were able to revolve around those guys. But the point being is they got top players. If you want your league to be better, give the best players to the worst teams. If you want to shrink the talent gap, give the best young players to the worst teams. But overall, let me know what you think about all of that down below in the comment section. This was a very, very long video. I 100% apologize. Just need to catch up a little bit of what was going on within the league. And there will be more content like this a little bit later. And that is why you should go down below, subscribe, leave a like to this channel, share with your friends, and also comment. Let me know what you think about a potential NBA expansion. Let me know what you think about the Chris Paul retirement, where he potentially is among all-time great point guards. Let me know about all of that down below in the comment section, as well as following us on all social medias. TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. All of those apps are going to be down below. We're on all of those social medias. You will get to see my latest reactions to breaking news within the NBA, the NFL, and combat sports. And by the way, you will also never miss for whenever the podcast decides to upload an episode. And without further ado, guys, that's all that I have for you guys today. I will see you guys on the next one. Have a great rest of your weekend. Peace.